We're here talking today about opt-out, the phenomenon in which families and students across the country, in some numbers, are opting out of standardized testing, and trying to sort of make sense of what's going on with that and what it might say about where we're at in education thinking in the country. And Jennifer, I'd be curious to hear your take. I know you were recently at a big national conference in Chicago, the Network for Public Education, I think. And I know there were some union leaders there and discussion of opt-out, and there are folks in the teachers union that have either encouraged it or at least voiced support for it. What's up with opt-out?
Well, I think this is a really interesting and exciting movement, and in addition to being at that conference in Chicago, I was also visiting a lot of schools. As a writer who is quite frustrated with the quality of education journalism, I seek out schools and stories that don't fit the narrative we're hearing, and we're hearing a lot about how this is an affluent white movement. So I dropped in to visit a high-poverty Latino school on the South Side where a student-led movement resulted in 80% of 8th graders opting out. And they told me that, they don't think it's fair that a test should be so much more central to their education than their more affluent white peers in other parts of the city. And so I think this movement is going to grow. I think it's going to become more diverse. And I don't think it's a coincidence that we're at a moment where there are actually a number of really interesting and unusual protest movements happening.
What do you make of it, Robert? Is it a great uprising of people who've been voiceless and not heard and represented?
Yeah, hard to say. I mean, every conversation about opt-out and testing sooner or later gets to it's complicated. So let's get it there quickly, shall we? It's complicated. As Jennifer knows, I have a fairly complicated relationship with testing in general. It's difficult to know even how to get into this conversation. I mean, first, I need to be convinced that it's an organic movement, as it were, before anything else. There's a lot of anxiety around testing. I get it. I've written a lot about it myself. I have a very complicated relationship with standardized testing. I've described it in pieces I've written for Fordham as the way Jefferson, I think, describes slavery. It's like holding a wolf by the ears. So education in general has this complicated relationship with testing, and the holding the wolf by the ears means you don't like it, but you can't let go. It has been observed that education reform runs on data. That's absolutely true. I've been somewhat critical of testing, not because I don't appreciate the impulse and the good things that have come from the data born of testing, but you can't be paying attention to what's going on in schools right now and not be concerned that the testing tail has come to wag the schooling dog. That's just reality. Where I net out on most of this is to say, okay, if testing is going to drive what happens in classrooms, and let's be honest, it does and it will, then we need to be very, very careful about the signals that we're sending to schools via testing. So what does this have to do with opt-out? Well, I'm sure there are as many reasons for parents opting out as there are parents. To the degree to which the opt-out phenomenon is driven by very real anxiety about things like curriculum narrowing and reducing education to ELA and math and not very much else, then I'm deeply sympathetic. To the degree to which this is kind of an immune response, pushing back on the accountability movement of the last decade or so, I'm marginally sympathetic. I think that same accountability movement has been somewhat nuance averse and has led to some of these bad outcomes or mixed signals coming out of schools. To the degree to which this is, and I'm not saying this is the case, but to the degree to which unions get involved and use this as a way to evade accountability, then I'm not sympathetic at all.
Right. I mean, I guess that is sort of the question.
Right.
If there has been even broadly some recognition that this is kind of the pendulum phenomenon, that the testing and accountability movement has maybe swung a little too far. We've had even the kingpin of testing himself, I guess, Arne Duncan, has made some noises about understanding that maybe there's too much of it going on or too much emphasis on it. So then I guess the question does become kind of one of these kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater thing, and I think that's what it comes down to, is there a way to sort of have some kind of a course correction?
Sure.
Or is this really a let's just sort of reverse or change course, completely from
but that course
for 20 years?
Right, that course correction is very, very difficult. As Jennifer knows, I've written quite a bit about about testing, and for example, ELA testing, reading testing, is just different. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but it's a lot easier to prepare for a subject area test and a math test than it is for an ELA test. So when I say testing, and my concerns about testing are almost exclusively based on the deleterious effects of reading tests. But the other note that I should have sounded and didn't, the one big concern I have about opt-out is whether regardless of what you think about the ed reform movement, charters, choice, etc. There can be no doubt that the data born of testing has created a certain dynamism in that sector of education, which has been, I think, a boon for low-income kids of color in this country, including students like mine in Harlem and the South Bronx. So my biggest concern about opt-out is that it can put an end or threatens that very real dynamism and I would argue good outcomes for those kinds of kids. So again, I take parental prerogative very, very seriously and almost axiomatically. I don't believe in telling parents what to do with their children, but I hope that at least there's some mindfulness, I hope, among parents who are opting out that there could be an unintended consequence here that could negatively affect poor black and brown kids.
I think that's a really, that's kind of the most fascinating part of this whole debate, and you're seeing that that erupt, just in the last couple of days, right? That is testing itself the civil right, and what you find, I seek out when I seek out these schools that don't fit the narrative. I'm really interested in how parents of color, how immigrant parents perceive their role in this, that when they choose to opt out, are they, the civil rights leaders are referring to this as sabotage. How do these parents see what they're doing? And what you hear them saying over and over again is that it's not the measurement per se, it's what's being done with the data. Right? If you're using the results to justify shutting our school down, if you're using the results to justify punishing our school for enrolling large numbers of, say, English language learners, that's where we're going to use the one thing we have, which is this data. And so, because these schools are in the minority, right? It's still largely an affluent white movement. I'm very interested. Well, what are the conditions in those cases that made it possible? And over again, you'll find that there's some organized effort, either by parents, sometimes in conjunction with the union, sometimes not, and that somebody explained to parents that this is actually a right that they have. And so what I'm interested to see is how that conversation starts to take root, because I totally agree with Robert. I'm a little disturbed by how much we agree on some of this stuff. The debate has not been nuanced enough, and just saying that, that somehow, I saw on a website yesterday that basically opt-out is throwing poor minority kids under the bus, and when that just makes me, I chortle when I see that, because I feel like that is just so overstating. You can make a reasoned argument, but like that's just, I think that's ridiculous.
Right.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, as Jennifer, as you know as well as anybody, the temperature around education debate at large is usually at a steady boil, and occasionally the pot boils over, like in this. Look, I don't have a lot of patience for the rhetoric like testing as a civil right. Well, that's just nonsense. And point made, but let's see if we can get away from the kind of silly, overheated rhetoric and just focus on this is one thing that we should be able to do at a place like CommonWealth.
But isn't the point may not be, it's overstating it maybe to say testing is a civil right, but I think what maybe both of you are referring to is just yesterday this coalition of civil rights groups did issue a statement, opposing the anti-testing efforts, and it was, a laundry list of the kind of who's who of the sort of top-line establishment groups, Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, the NAACP, LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, etc. And so I don't think they're saying testing is a civil right, but I think, as with so many arguments in education reform, it's very freighted, and so it's not the testing per se that people think is so sacrosanct. It's sort of what it seems to represent. And you had comments from people like Katie Haycock from the Education Trust. Kids who are not tested end up not counting. I mean, that's kind of been the foundation of the argument of places like the Education Trust and others, and it's kind of why at least there has been an argument made that the sort of standards and testing and accountability movement has been in some ways part of a civil rights recognition that for too long we've just kind of not been measuring and counting what's happening with schools, and that's led to kind of decades of neglect, benign neglect, to invoke an old term.
Or less than benign neglect. I mean, I guess my own perspective on this is I began teaching in the South Bronx in 2002. So me and Joel Klein basically started at the New York City Department of Education on virtually the same day. And as I like to tell this story, my school, PS 277, was in District 7, which is the lowest scoring district in New York City. My school was the lowest scoring school in District 7. So I kind of had a front row seat for what it looks like when testing hit hard. And I always take pains to say, look, my school was not a media cliche, inner city, hellhole. It was mostly good people trying and failing. Very humane. Everybody knew everybody's name. The principal spoke fluent Spanish, etc. It was Carmen Farina would like this school. It felt like a good community school. It was also not a very good school. And again, separate conversation for another time. It was not because it had, I would argue, more to do with the way our teachers are trained and our curriculum, etc. But there was an unmistakable change in the wind once we got serious about testing. If you recall, we used to have grade band testing prior to No Child Left Behind. It used to be 4th, 8th, and 12th grade. Suddenly, every year was a testing year. Every teacher basically was responsible and accountable for test scores, and it just changed the dynamic of the school. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say it made it better. The test scores were still, frankly, awful. But it demonstrated to me that accountability that you could pull a lever and make something happen. So ever since then, the more interesting question to me is, okay, you've got this power that accountability gives you. What levers do you want to pull? So my criticism of testing is less to do with testing qua testing than the signals that it sends instructionally. Any good accountability regime should encourage the behaviors in school that you want to see. Testing is a bit of a blunt instrument, so it's not working as well as we might like, but at the risk of repeating myself, I certainly don't want anybody to wax sentimental for the days before we had testing and everything was great. Those days never existed.
And is it sort of like the the old line about democracy, that it's at this point better than any of the alternatives? I mean, what would we put in its place? And I guess that's what I always when I hear folks. I mean, I've gone to hear Diane Ravitch after her book came out. She came to Harvard Ed School, and I was very eager to go really hear her lay out in sort of full detail the alternative program. And I came away, kind of hungry. It was pretty light fare, other than let's value teaching and value schools and a rich curriculum. And I think that's something that everybody wants, but the question is, what do you kind of scaffold that with, or how do you, other than sort of, wish and a prayer and everyone kind of saying they're going to row in the same direction, how do you make that happen? And the one thing I was going to say, Robert, I know I've seen you've written that really the problem here is it shouldn't be seen as testing per se, but it's this sort of the test prep culture and obsession, some would say, that has surrounded it. And you've kind of argued that in, again, some ideal world, if we could get parents, I think you wrote, instead of opting out, to sort of insist on opting out of this test prep phenomenon, just have a rich curriculum, and that you've made the case that kids will do as well, almost, evidence shows, as they do under this test prep mania.
I have not seen any good evidence that test prep is effective at raising test scores, at least not on the language arts side. I've not visited or done what Jennifer has done and visited a lot of schools in Chicago, but I would be curious, Jennifer, if you spend any time in affluent schools in Chicago or elsewhere. My very strong hunch, is that if if we try to do on the Upper East Side of Manhattan what we do in the South Bronx when it comes to this, daily 2 hours a day of test prepping, well, the parents of PS6, where Carmen Farina used to teach, would reject that like a baboon litter. They just simply would not put up with it. And that's the right answer. I mean, parents, I think, have a lot more leverage to influence instructional and curriculum decisions than they think. Parents on the Upper East Side of Manhattan are not reluctant to call, to write, to show up, to demand what they want for their kids. Parents in my school, I don't think appreciated the degree to which they had that power as well. So this is hence my hope that the opt-out movement can turn into something positive, where parents, rather than just throwing up their hands and saying, we're out of here, will say, listen, here's what we want to see. And by the way, if we don't see a rich curriculum, we're not taking the test. If you try to get rid of music and art and gym and science and whatnot, we're not taking the test. That just strikes me as a much more productive conversation than tests bad, we're leaving.
Can I just shout out to your really impressive use of animal metaphors? We've had a wolf, a dog, and now we've had a baboon litter. And I cannot.
Meanwhile, I was throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so I don't know what that says about me.
I know. So actually, Robert, the issue this is the thing that motivates me most these days. That if you live in a state like Massachusetts that has just an enormous class divide. The quality, like what you spend your days doing if you live in an affluent community like Manchester by the Sea that's just down the road from me, versus if you're in an urban district, they're incomparable. And if you're in Manchester, you're having your whole child educated. Right now, you're doing a science project with your hands, and you're being groomed to be a steward of the earth. If you're in an urban district, chances are you're doing you're preparing for a diagnostic test to show you how well you're going to do on the actual test. And I've actually been following a family in an urban district that's been trying to opt out of test prep, and have seen how difficult this is, that we were able to FOIA the communications between the district, the school, and the parents. And basically the argument of the district is that assessment and teaching are now inseparable. And I thought this is a really, what this family is trying to do is right. You would love them. They are like the poster parents of your next article.
Yeah.
And but they've also identified just how hard it is as parents to push back against a school that's now all organizing to boost those math and ELA scores, or this is another district that is looming under a state takeover.
Right. See, remember when I said up top that this conversation will sooner or later get to, it's complicated? Well,
yes, it's complicated.
Here we go again. This is where I leave, or my critique, as it were, leaves schools and goes to, say, ed schools. A point taken that good instruction and good test prep could be the same thing. I could see where that might be true in math, or my daughter right now is studying for an AP test in physics and AP US history, where the curriculum and the test are aligned. If you study for the test, you're mastering the material. For reasons I just don't think we have time to go into right now, that is simply not the case for a reading test. A reading test, as I've said many times, is really a de facto test of background knowledge. So the best test prep for a reading test is probably no test prep at all. It's math, it's history, it's geography. Yeah. Well, it's reading, but I would argue, and you and I might disagree slightly, it's strategic reading. It has to be broad and all-encompassing and cover the waterfront in terms of content area. That a reading test is really more of a measure of background knowledge than it is of any particular reading comprehension skill. So I lay this one, this body elsewhere, because what passes for reading comprehension teaching in this country misses the mark. When anytime your kid is being told, visualize, question the author, find the main idea, use reading skills and strategies, they're probably wasting time that could be better spent doing other things. That paradoxically would better prepare them for a reading test.
So do you think, maybe to try to sort of wrap this up, I know we've solved this whole thing in about 15 or 20 minutes, which is amazing. We should all, congratulate ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, is there, do you both think there's any possibility that that what's going on with opt-out sort of, gets us to a better place? Can we get to, Robert's ideal that, we don't totally throw out the idea that we should see how kids are doing and where schools are at, but that we can throw this monkey off our back. There's my animal of kind of obsessive test prep, and to his point, recognize, and maybe it's not that testing is the blunt instrument, it's that it's been wielded like a blunt instrument by bringing in all this test prep when Robert's arguing that a really rich curriculum is not only what we think everybody wants for their child, but it's also the thing that would do the best job at getting kids to perform well on these tests. That we've misread what it takes to have kids achieve well on these tests. I mean, it's not really filling in bubbles. It's the stuff that prepares you to fill them in.
I'm actually really hopeful about that, and not just because, as someone who proudly resides on the left, I love a protest movement, and I especially love a protest movement that gets results. I think we're going to pivot to a different place in this whole debate, and I see shifts in communities where you're starting to see people talk about, well, what kind of schools do we actually want? There's a really interesting project taking place here in Massachusetts that, Michael, this would be a great guest for you to have on one of your shows. Jack Schneider at Holy Cross is working with parents in urban communities to develop a fuller measure of how do you define what an excellent school really is? What are the metrics that parents really value? So I'm hoping that our conversation starts to tilt that way. And is less about just being against something, but I do think that opt-out is going to continue to grow, because if you look at what's happening around the country, legislators cannot run away from the high stakes part of this fast enough. And just like Fight for 15, the fast food movement is seeing real results with minimum wage and getting actual companies to raise wages, there's nothing that grows a protest movement faster than when people feel like what they're doing is actually having an impact.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm professionally optimistic, but I'm also very mindful of the history of education and education reform, and it does seem like we have this reflexive moving from pillar to post, as it were. We correct and then overcorrect. So it would not be hard to imagine going from test everything within an inch of its life to no tests. And that would just be a bad outcome, I think, for the kids that draw me to this work, low-income kids of color in places like the South Bronx and Harlem. I worry, to Jennifer's point, that we're having a nuance-averse discussion, and nuance-averse discussions tend to lead to nuance-averse outcomes. So I would like to be optimistic that we could have a subtle, nuanced view of schools and look, if local control means anything in education, it should mean that I have some say over what happens in my school, in my community, and decisions should not be made at some far remove. That is both a feature and a flaw, I guess you could say, of American education. So I hope that those who are seizing the wheel use it wisely. But again, my deep concern about this is that what happens in affluent suburbs, those kids sneeze and my kids catch cold is usually the way it works.
Absolutely.
So I just hope I hope we can avoid that outcome at all costs.
Can you use an animal metaphor to describe what you're concerned about?
Now you put me on the spot. I'll get back to you.
Well, the cold must have something to do with bird flu or something.
Oh,
there you go. Boom.
Perfect.
Well done. Well done.
All right. Well, maybe we'll try to be the champions of nuance and recognizing the complexity, and maybe we'll take this up again. So thanks to both of you for joining in.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks so much.